Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual UCL Institute of the Americas, wherever you are in the world. I'm Gareth Davis. I teach US history at the Institute, and I'm the co-convener with my colleague Enrique Castañón of our year-long series of talks on environment and society in the Americas. And if you would like full details of the series, which is going to consist of a mixture of online and in-person events, please go to the events page of the UCL Institute of the Americas, where you will also find details of the other series we're running this year, organized by my colleague Aaron Hiltner on the Americas and the world. So it's a great pleasure to inaugurate the series with David Silkenat. And David is a senior lecturer in American history at Edinburgh University. David's taught there for 9 years. Before that, he taught at North Dakota State, and he got his doctorate from UNC, where his mentor was Fitz Brundage. David is the author of an impressive 4 single-authored books, the first 3 of which dealt with aspects of the social and intellectual legacy of the Civil War, the most recent of which, out this year, this spring, is this handsome book, if you can see it, Scars on the Land, an environmental history of slavery in the American South, published by Oxford University Press. And it's got back cover blurbs from Walter Johnson, pretty impressive, but my favorite blurb is from Manisha Sinha, and I just want to read it out to you. Describes it as an astoundingly original history of Southern slavery. To the crimes against humanity committed by enslavers, one can add environmental destruction. It is the enslaved whose interactions with the flora, fauna, and landscape allow them to create alternative geographies of freedom who emerge as stewards of the South. Scars on the Land reveals perceptively the long afterlives of slavery all around us. And David has kindly agreed to spend maybe 30 to 40 minutes telling us about the book, about its principal themes, about its intellectual contributions, what he sees as being newest and freshest and most exciting about it. Maybe if you have time, David, you could tell us what you're going to do next as well. If you've
Sure. No, I'm happy to do that too.
Out.
Yeah.
So without further ado, David, fire away. And,
Okay.
You've got 30 to 40 minutes, and then everybody will have a similar amount of time for questioning.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen now, and we'll see if that actually works. Hey, it does. At least it seems it does. Can people see? People can see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Okay. Well, that will distract from everything else. Right. So thank you very much for being here today. I'm very honored to inaugurate this series and to be with you this afternoon. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. So I just wanted to start by sort of telling you a bit about where this book came from and how I approached writing it. Its origins, I think, actually start with Hurricane Katrina. I was very struck, like I think most of you were, in seeing the images of Hurricane Katrina, the destruction that it caused, but also the ways in which the people who suffered the most in Hurricane Katrina were people who were poor and African American. And to think, it caused me to really start to think critically about what is the relationship between the environment and race in our modern world, and as I think, as we all know, that these are areas that are increasingly being seen as being intersectional, but also to think about what its history is, how the experience of African Americans, not only in the present, but in the past, was shaped by the environment. So that's really what sort of drove me to write this book. And obviously in the last 3 or 4 years when I was researching and writing this project, the Black Lives Matter movement was very much in the headlines every day, as was our increasing global awareness of the climate crisis and other environmental tragedies that are befalling us every day. And trying to think about how those fit together, I think it really much shaped the questions that drove the book. As Gareth mentioned, I'm by background and training a historian of the American South. I've written a series of books about slavery, about emancipation, about the Civil War. But this was my first foray into environmental history, and it required me to obviously do a great deal amount of research to learn about how environmental history worked. It required me to read quite broadly in environmental history, both in the context of the American South, but outside of the American South. But it also caused me to read sources differently, to read sources, many of which I was deeply familiar with, reading them through certain lenses, to read them through an environmental lens. And new messages and new sort of signs emerged to me from these sources. And so I think that might be a good place to sort of start with what this book is trying to do. The primary body of sources that I was working with in trying to write this book, the voices that I wanted to center, if you will, were the voices of the enslaved. And we have lots of ways of getting at the experience of the enslaved, most prominently in fugitive slave narratives and in some interviews that were done with formerly enslaved people in the 1930s. And I found if you read those through an environmental lens, a whole nother image sort of emerges from them. I'm pointing out here two of the more important ones for this project. Solomon Northup is on the left. Many of you may be familiar with him if you haven't read his book, but with the movie that was made from his book, 12 Years a Slave. He was kidnapped into slavery and served in bondage in Louisiana, and was a very keen observer of the landscape there. The other source that was really particularly insightful for me was Charles Ball's narrative. Unfortunately, we don't have a good image of what Ball looked like. He was enslaved in Maryland, but then was sold south to South Carolina and Georgia, and experienced a variety of different kinds of slavery. He worked on a tobacco plantation. He worked on a rice plantation. He worked for a while at a fishery. And so he was able to see a number of different landscapes and drew some very powerful connections between his own experience in slavery and the ways in which slavery was impacting the environment. I also tried to listen to what the enslavers said about slavery. So many planters, if you will, if you want to use that term, thought seriously about the environment. Here we have two of them that I relied upon pretty extensively. Edmund Ruffin, who was a prominent agricultural reformer in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And on the right, of course, is Thomas Jefferson, who thought very extensively about the land and the ways in which he was using land and the ways in which enslaved people were transforming the land. Most enslavers I found, though, were not as insightful as Ruffin and Jefferson were. And the third group of sources that I relied upon that were just enormously fascinating for me were the writings of scientists who visited the American South, scientists and naturalists and people who were trying to chronicle the landscape of the American South. Because they often visited the South, sometimes from the North, sometimes from Europe. And they came to observe the trees and the rocks and the animals and what have you. But they also very often were very keen observers of slavery and drawing connections between them. So here are two of the ones that were quite prominent. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and John James Audubon, who was an ornithologist, both of whom spent a lot of time in the South doing scientific work ostensibly, but also chronicling the relationship between nature and slavery. The book fundamentally really asks two big questions. And the first question that the book tries to deal with is about how the environment shaped the lives of the enslaved. Here I thought I would just read you the quotation the book begins with by a man named William Anderson, who was enslaved in Mississippi. And he's trying to explain why more people from Mississippi didn't run away. And he says, "It is almost impossible for slaves to escape from that part of the South. There are a great many things to encounter in escaping: large and small rivers, lakes, panthers, bears, snakes, alligators, white and black men, bloodhounds, guns, and above all, the danger of starvation." And what I found intriguing about that passage and others like it is the ways in which Anderson is saying, look, there's human barriers to escaping from slavery. There are slave catchers, there are slave patrols, there are people with guns, but there's also all of these natural barriers to freedom. And that his life in slavery was, like the other 4 million people enslaved at the time, very much shaped by the environments that they were in. They suffered from the heat in the summer sun. They suffered from bitter cold in winter in some parts of the South. They had to deal with wild animals. They had to deal with domesticated animals. They had to deal with a number of environmental factors that were part and parcel of the brutality of slavery. So what it is to work on a rice plantation or a tobacco plantation, part of the brutality is the brutality imposed by the lash, by the law, by the social conventions of slavery. But part of the brutality is also embedded within the environment. So here, for instance, we see an enslaved man and his wife who have escaped. You can see the shackles on his hand, who are being pursued by bloodhounds. Many enslavers kept dogs for the purpose of tracking enslaved people, and here he is trying to fight them off. And so part of the book is trying to address the ways in which the environment defined much of the lives of the enslaved. At the same time, I found that enslaved people developed a profound knowledge of the environment, that they understood the geography, the landscape in ways that enslavers didn't. They understood the paths, for instance, that connected one plantation to another. I noticed Emily West is in the audience. She's written extensively about how, enslaved people often had family connections on neighboring plantations. And part of what enabled them to do that was an environmental knowledge that allowed them to escape at night just from their plantation through the woods to other plantations. But they also did things like they hunted in the woods, they trapped, they fished, they used medicines that were derived from native plants. There's all kinds of knowledge that enslaved people had that not only allowed them to live in slavery and be able to survive the horrors of slavery, but also sometimes to escape to freedom, that there was a body of knowledge that they possessed and that was really critical to them. The second big question that the book addresses is what effect slavery as an institution had upon the environment of the American South. What effect did the slavery as an economic system, as a social system, as a political system, how did that transform the landscape? And here what I found essentially was that enslavers saw their wealth and power not in the land that they owned, but in the people that they owned. That's where the repository of their wealth and power rested. And that they ended up seeing the land fundamentally as disposable, that they could use the land, they could abuse the land and the trees and the rivers and other natural aspects, because they believed that there was always more land available for them further west. And this is an environmental ethos that we see from the very beginning of American slavery. In the Chesapeake, we see enslavers saying, look, we can grow tobacco for an amazing amount of profit in the short term. Will it destroy the soil? Will it render the soil infertile to do so? Yes. But there's always more soil that we can acquire. There's trees we can cut down and plant tobacco again somewhere else and bring the wealth and power we have in enslaved labor with us. And we see this repeating itself over and over again in the American South, where enslavers are constantly looking for the next enslaved frontier, the next place they can push the institution of slavery to fertile soil, to new forests, to other resources that they can exploit. And this had tremendous consequences. It had tremendous consequences for indigenous peoples. So if we think about Indian removal and wars against Native peoples that happened during the colonial period, in the early republic, throughout the antebellum period, Indian removal was driven in large part by this desire by white Southerners, by white enslavers, to possess more land because the land that they already had was becoming exhausted. It helps to explain wars like the wars against Mexico, but also things like the Louisiana Purchase. It also helps to explain the domestic slave trade, and we can think about the number of people who are sold from the Upper South, places like Virginia, to the Deep South, something on the order of 1 million people being sold during the first half of the 19th century. All of that is being driven in part by an environmental ethos that is pushing slavery west. It also helps to explain why white Southerners were so horrified at ideas about stopping the spread of slavery in Western territories. If you know anything about the coming of the Civil War, these are all about debates about slavery in the West. And white Southerners are adamant that slavery must be allowed to spread west. And this is based in part because they have this environmental ethos that slavery needs to spread in order to survive. I think one way to sort of make sense of some of the themes of the book, though, is to look at some very specific locations, because one of the arguments I'm making in Scars in the Land is that the environment the environment of the American South is a very diverse place. It's got mountains, it's got lakes, it's got forests, it has rivers, all of which are very specific places. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those in my talk today. The first is the turpentine forests of eastern North Carolina. Turpentine is extracted from trees, so it is something like extracting maple syrup or something. And turpentine was a very important product in the colonial era in the 19th century. And it was used primarily for naval stores. So it's used for making tar, it's used for making various other kinds of things that are used in ships. So it's a very important product. And the way you extract turpentine from trees is you cut a gash in the tree. And the gash in the tree causes the turpentine, the sap, to flow. And it flows down the tree into a cavity that's actually carved into the tree. and it flows for a period of time until that part of the tree dries up, in which case you have to cut another gash in it to reopen basically open up a fresh wound. And so what you have on turpentine trees, and you can see it here in these images, is you have these series of gashes that go up the trunk of the tree as the tree is repeatedly chipped again. That's what's the people who were making these gashes are called chippers. And almost all of this work is being done by enslaved people. They are, you would have two gangs essentially of enslaved people in turpentine forest, one group who are chippers, who are carving these scars into the trees, and the other group who are called dippers, who are scooping out the raw turpentine from the cavity carved within the tree. And this was very difficult and dangerous work. It's difficult in part because any kind of lumbering is very challenging, but this is additionally difficult because the work left you covered in sap. So whether you're a chipper or a dipper, you are probably being covered head to toe with raw turpentine, which is not good for your skin. You're also inhaling turpentine fumes, which are toxic. So you are doing very difficult and deadly, if you will, labor. What happened to these turpentine forests, which used to spread for hundreds of thousands of acres, is that there was a boom in the demand for turpentine in the 1830s and 1840s. And when that happened, enslavers demanded that more and more turpentine be extracted from these trees. They said, look, it's not enough to simply chip one side of the tree, you should chip on all sides of the tree and chip higher on the tree to try to get as much turpentine from these trees as possible. And they did this knowing that chipping the trees that extensively would kill the trees. Removing this much bark leaves them liable to beetle infestation, to various other kinds of infections and rots. It also makes them much more flammable. Sometimes these turpentine forests would go up in flame, including the enslaved people who are living within them. So much so that within a generation, the turpentine industry basically destroyed itself, that the desire for short-term profits decimated the turpentine forests, so much so that if you go to North Carolina today, which was the epicenter of the turpentine industry, there are no more turpentine trees left. They've been replaced all by a different kind of pine tree, which is very pretty, but doesn't produce any turpentine. And I think this sort of reflects the ethos that was embedded within slavery's relationship to the environment. We're going to move a few hundred miles west of there to North Georgia, where there was a gold rush in 1829. So many of you, I imagine, are familiar with the California gold rush. This is a generation earlier, where gold was found in Georgia, also in Western North Carolina, also into parts of Alabama. And it was gold mining in which most of the most difficult labor and dangerous labor was done by enslaved people. We see on the images there, enslaved gold miners going hundreds of feet underground to extract gold ore from the earth. This is, as you would know, just very difficult and dangerous work. Many enslaved miners died. If they didn't die, they are inhaling lots of coal. They're inhaling lots of ore dust. They are sometimes using explosives to dig these, produce these mines, which is obviously not the safest material to use. The mining was half of the danger of this industry. Once they had extracted the gold ore from the ground, the gold ore was ground up in a mill, but then they had to separate the the gold itself from the rest of the rock. And the way they did this was using what was essentially a shaker, in which the gold ore dust was mixed with water and mercury. And then that would allow them to amalgamate the gold and separate it from the rest of the rock. The mercury obviously poisoned the miners themselves, but it also poisoned the rivers. So we have accounts of what this gold region was like, especially in Georgia, by visitors. And they say, look, all the trees in the neighboring hills have all been cut down. The rivers, which once held tremendous numbers of fish, are now all barren. There's rock detritus everywhere. And it's a site in which the enslaved miners are suffering, but also the landscape itself reflects the kind of brutality of the industry. Lots of very prominent enslavers invested very heavily in these gold mines. John C. Calhoun, for instance, the most vocal advocate for slavery in the antebellum period, was one of the largest of the mine owners. Going further west to Louisiana, this is Belle Chase Plantation, which was a sugar plantation in Louisiana, not far from New Orleans. Like most sugar plantations, it was located not far from the Mississippi, and it was guarded from the Mississippi by a very extensive system of levees built along the Mississippi River. This is a levee system that was started really as soon as French settlement began in Louisiana. And it was a levee system that was built almost exclusively with enslaved labor. And it was designed to keep the Mississippi from overflowing its banks and inundating the fields. One of the consequences, though, of these levees is that the levees kept not only the Mississippi within its banks, but it also kept all of the silt in the Mississippi from overflowing, which is usually what it had done prior to European colonization. Which meant that the higher they built the levees, actually the higher the base of the river became, because the silt would drop to the bottom of the river, and so the base of the river would elevate as the levees got higher. So much so that by the 1850s, the river itself is actually now significantly higher than the land around it. Which meant that when these levees broke, and they often broke, it caused an enormous inundation of the surrounding landscape. And that's what happened at Belle Chase Plantation. The levee broke, enslaved people were sent to try to repair the levee, which is very dangerous work. There are lots of accounts of when levees break, enslaved people being forced to try to fill the crevice and dying in the process. What happened here, though, was typical of what happened in many cases when levees broke. The waters inundated the fields. They inundated the slave cabins, so the enslaved people, the possessions that they have, all were lost. Some of the cabins themselves washed away. Those that were left were caked in mud. The big house where the enslaver lived, of course, was built on high ground, and so that survived the flood. But most of the rest of the property was underwater. And the guy who owned the plantation decided that the only thing to do at this point was, since he had lost his sugar crop for the year, was to sell off some of his enslaved property to make up for the deficit. And so he sells off a large section of the people that he owned in a very fashionable hotel in New Orleans, a place that actually Harry Beecher Stowe mentions in Uncle Tom's Cabin as being a site of particular degradation. And we can see on the right of the screen, actually the bill of sale for this plantation. where they list the names of the people who are going to be auctioned off, their ages. If you look closely, you can figure out who is related to who. There's some families embedded within it, and occupations, and what have you. And we don't know what happened to these people. They appear to have been bought by a number of different bidders, so the families are split up, communities are split up. We do know, however, what happened to the person who owned the plantation. He went on to get elected to the United States Senate from Louisiana, and then he went on to be the Confederate Secretary of State and Treasury and War, a guy by the name of Judah P. Benjamin. So he became one of the leading proponents and activists in the Confederate cause. But this is, I think, is another example of the ways in which environmental destruction caused particular harm for enslaved people. A similar kind of phenomenon happened when hurricanes hit. We have many accounts of hurricanes hitting the American South during the colonial period, throughout the first half of the 19th century. Probably the one that's best documented is the Last Island hurricane. Last Island was a barrier island just off of Louisiana. It was a resort island, essentially. So it was where the wealthy, the planter class of Louisiana went to escape the heat. It was essentially a large sandbar upon which they had built a hotel, a number of beach houses, and dozens of slave quarters, because the wealthy planters who summered there needed large numbers of enslaved people to care for them. This is a hurricane that, when it hit the island, destroyed most of the island. I mean, quite literally, most of the island is no longer there. If you go today, you can get a sense from the map, the ways in which the hurricane washed away most of Last Island. And there's a capture image there from a 19th century magazine that shows the survivors of the hurricane grabbing onto whatever they could to survive. What we find, though, at Last Island and in many of these hurricanes is that enslaved peoples were a disproportionate number of those who were killed. This hurricane didn't just stop here on the island, it went inland, and we have accounts by enslaved people of the effect that this hurricane had. One in particular describes slave quarters being lifted 100 feet in the air and then smashing to the ground. And of course, they had no warning that these hurricanes are coming. Last place I'd like to take you is to the Great Dismal Swamp. This is what the Great Dismal Swamp looks like if you're looking for a vacation destination. This is a swamp that borders North Carolina and Virginia. It's huge. It covers thousands and thousands of acres. It's got an enormous lake in the middle. And what's interesting about the Great Dismal Swamp and other swamps like it across the American South is these were sites where maroon communities developed. That is to say, communities of African Americans who had fled slavery and tried to establish a life for themselves in the swamp. And this is places where enslaved people are using their knowledge of the swamp and the inhospitability of the swamp as a way of creating a kind of freedom for themselves. And we have accounts of maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp in the early 18th century. We have accounts of maroons in the swamp throughout the end of the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, and until the Civil War. So these are not just short-term running away to the swamp, but these are communities that are lasting for generations. Here we see an image of enslaved people running away to the swamp, being chased by bloodhounds. And these maroon communities that existed in the Great Dismal Swamp were not secret. These were well-known entities. There were poems written about them. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel about them. The existence of these maroon communities were not secret, but efforts to try to root them out of the swamp failed over and over again, in large part because the enslaved people, or Maroons, knew how to use the swamp to defend themselves from whites who were trying to intervene. Probably the most concerted effort to try to drain this swamp, which is a phrase that means something very different in the 19th century or the 18th century than it does today, was George Washington. He forms a Dismal Swamp Company whose intent purpose was to both drain the swamp and convert it into plantation land, and to get rid of Maroon communities that existed within it. And they managed to build a number of canals through the swamp, some of which are still in use, but it didn't extract the Maroons who live there. And they live very hard lives. We have some archaeology from the Great Dismal Swamp and other Maroon communities in the American South. Some of them are living on the borders of the swamp, so they're trading with people who are still enslaved. Some of them are much deeper in the swamp, but it is a very challenging life for them. There's a reason why people don't live in swamps for the most part. It's because these are, ecosystems that are largely not very fit for human habitation. But the perseverance of these Maroon communities, I think, it demonstrates how powerfully enslaved people, wanted to create a kind of freedom for themselves, even if it meant living in a swamp that was filled with alligators and snakes and what have you. The Great Dismal Swamp is the most famous of these and best documented, but we have other Maroon communities in South Carolina and Louisiana and other parts of the South that are using a similar kind of environmental knowledge. And the book ends trying to use the book ends by trying to look at emancipation. And historiographically, there's been a big debate about how to understand emancipation, how to understand the end of slavery in the United States. And of course, I think as all of you know, the traditional explanation centers on Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. But that since the 1970s, many historians have been looking at the ways in which enslaved people themselves are agents of their own liberation, that they are self-emancipating by running away to Union lines, and that this flight of enslaved people is what drove emancipation as much as things that are coming out of the White House. And more recently, people have tried to sort of add a geographic element to this, looking at the significance of the Union Army as an agent of liberation. What I tried to do there is to add to that debate by looking at the ways in which the environment also factors into this. And some of you may be familiar with this image. It's a photo of the Rappahannock River in 1862 and enslaved people running to freedom, carrying with them some cattle and a wagon. And you can see the Union Army there on the left, who are protecting them, if you will, as they escape to freedom. What I think is striking about this image is how low the river is. That the Rappahannock was several feet lower than it usually was that time of year, that there was a drought, and that shaped the ability of enslaved people to flee to freedom. If you were to imagine this river and having it be several feet higher, it would have been impossible to cross, or very difficult to cross, in a wagon like this. And so if we want to make sense of emancipation, looking at it through an environmental lens reveals elements that we previously didn't pay attention to. And one of the things I emphasize in that section of the book is that enslaved people brought with them a tremendous amount of environmental knowledge that they shared with the Union Army. Knowledge about the geography, knowledge about the landscape, knowledge about how to use the resources, the natural resources of the South to their advantage. And this environmental knowledge that the Union Army, that enslaved people provided as spies, as scouts, and then later as soldiers, was a significant factor in Union victory. And so if we want to sort of fully make sense of the ways in which African Americans contributed to the Union war effort, this environmental knowledge they brought to bear, I think is really critical to it. But I think I've been speaking for about half an hour, 40 to 35 minutes or something. So I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. And Gareth, I think we should open the floor for questions if that's the.
Sure, that's fine, David. Have I successfully unmuted myself? Can you hear me, David?
You have, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
okay. Oh, well, that's a minor triumph. Good, okie doke. So I guess we've got about maybe 45 minutes for questions. And if your screen looks like mine, you should have a raised hand icon at the bottom of it. And I'll do my best, but I'm relying on you to help me, David, because I'm not very good at this. Oh God, now there's 4. I think,
Well,
Emily, I think you were first. So do you want to...
I think the chat has them in the order that they were raised, but I'm happy to have Emily go first.
Well,
all right.
I'll let Emily go then first.
Yeah, thanks both. I think it was a close thing who was first. So apologies if I have pushed in at all. And thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed that. And apologies, I haven't yet read the book, but I'm looking forward to it.
It only came out in April, so you're forgiven.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the mention as well. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned right at the end. I mean, because I was interested in your distinction between, you know, the sort of firstly, you know, the way in which the environment shaped the lives of enslaved people, and then you were looking at the impacts of slavery on the environment. And I think what you spoke about today was really about, you know, the system of slavery, rather than the sort of the knowledge of enslaved people that you alluded to just at the end, and, you know, the environmental knowledge, for example, that they brought in terms of emancipation. I thought that was really interesting. And I just wondered if you could expand upon that a little bit. I mean, maybe thinking as well about, you know, sort of African belief systems, cosmologies. I'm thinking especially about enslaved women, you know, so bringing in a gender perspective and thinking about, you know, sort of botanical knowledge, biodiversity, you know, women as medical practitioners. And I just wondered whether your book dealt with any of that as well.
Yes, it does. Probably not as fully as I could have in some ways, but can't do everything in a book. You know, so one of the ways in which gender is addressed is you and other people have written about this. So I'm bringing back to you what you already know. But for the benefit of everyone else, you know, the kind of geographic footprint that enslaved people had was gendered, right? That enslaved men had some ways have access to different kinds of geographies that enslaved women do. So, you know, the ability to go into the forests, to do the various kinds of you know, moving between plantations was easier for enslaved men. But enslaved women, I think, are also tremendously, you know, knowledgeable about the kinds of resources that wild spaces have, that areas that were outside of the dominion of or the oversight of their owners. There's one account, for instance, in the book of an enslaved woman who, anytime slave traders came through, she would take her enslaved children and take them into the woods, on the supposition is as long as they were not there when the slave trader came, she could protect them there. But enslaved women are also using, you know, natural resources, you know, the wild plants for birth control. They're using it for medicine. You know, there are all whole realms of both African and African American medical and spiritual beliefs, and sometimes disentangling those can be difficult, about certain kinds of plants and how to use them. But in, you know, one of the sections of the book is looking at how enslaved people make sense of their own diet. And, you know, the often way we talk about the enslaved diet is we say, look, slaves had a ration of so many, you know, a peck of corn and so much, you know, pork or what have you. I think that's fundamentally misunderstanding the enslaved diet. I think most enslaved people, and to be sure, there's a whole lot of variation depending on who's running the plantation and where it is, are using both domesticated and wild plants and animals very extensively. So I think there's lots of hunting going on. There's lots of trapping going on. But they're doing so in a very particular way. For instance, one of the things that the book talks about is lots of enslaved people had dogs. Because if you don't have a gun, and most enslaved people don't have guns, some of them do, but most don't. How do you hunt without a gun or without a weapon? And if you have a dog, your ability to get rabbits and other kinds of things you might want to eat just increases exponentially. And Charles Ball, who I talked about earlier as being one of the main sources, he has a dog, and he describes his, that's the best friend he has in slavery. He has family members who are sold away from him, but he gets to keep his dog. But then when he decides to try to escape from slavery, he has this very sort of tragic going away speech to his dog. That what's really keeping him from running away immediately is that his dog was loyal to him. So I hope they answered some of your questions.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, David. Looking forward to reading it.
Adam, you're up next.
Oh, hello. Yes, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation and talk. As I see it, you presented a perfect storm of the horrors for slaves and also just people living in these areas, because the greed of the plantation owners, the general lack of technical knowledge and capability in those times, but above all, the lack of what appears to be legislation and funding from some central federal government. Is it a question that, or did shall we say, the federal government or state government put any effort in trying to improve the environment? You mentioned, for instance, Washington doing some sort of drainage, but how extensive was that, and was that really feasible at that time?
The drainage that Washington does with the Great Dismal Swamp Company, it's a private corporation that he establishes before the Revolution. And, it's feasible because he has access to a tremendous amount of enslaved labor, which is what they are using to dig these drainage canals. And so, you can go to the Great Dismal Swamp today and see it. But in terms of government oversight, I think white Southerners are very suspicious of federal government oversight, especially for things that are sort of directly on the ground in the South. So we can see, opposition to federal support for roads and what have you during the Jacksonian period as being part of that. One of the ways, though, you can see some the role of the federal government actually happens afterwards, after the end of slavery, where prior to the Civil War, responsibility for the levees in Louisiana and in Mississippi and further on up the river, the responsibility for the levees rested with the people who lived on the river. And in Louisiana in particular, if you could not maintain the levee where you lived, you had to sell your land. And therefore, one of the things that did was it reinforced enslavers as being the people who had access to riverfront property, because they're the only ones who can command the labor to maintain the levees. You had to sort of have to constantly repair and maintain levees. When slavery ends, when slavery is destroyed, that responsibility actually shifts to the federal government, and the federal government in the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century assumes responsibility for this kind of engineering work. And you mentioned, just in passing, sort of the ignorance of enslavers about the circumstances. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize in the book is actually that enslavers are not ignorant about what they are doing. They're actually quite knowledgeable about the consequences of the choices they are making. That, you know, okay, they are, for instance, the planters in Virginia are sometimes told, you know, you should fertilize your soil, you should practice crop rotation, you should do all these things that they knew how to do to keep land fertile and keep the soil from eroding and all this kind of stuff. And they said no. They said we're not doing that, and we're not doing it because it is more profitable for us to take this land, extract as much value as we can from it, and find new land than it would be for us to preserve this land. And so it's a knowledgeable choice that they're making. You know, and those who decide not to leave Virginia for Alabama or Mississippi, you know, at the end say, ooh, we made a huge mistake. We should have just left this land because it's no longer productive. You know, and so it's not as if this environmental destruction that happens is a product of ignorance. It's a choice, and a knowledgeable choice. The same is true with the sort of turpentine forest I discussed at the sort of beginning of my talk. Enslavers knew what the consequences would be of heavily extracting turpentine from those trees. They knew that they were destroying those forests, and that what would come in their place would not produce any turpentine. But they didn't care, which may or may not, for some of you, have more contemporary resonances.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bill Booth and then Jay.
Hi there, thank you. That was a very interesting talk, and it brought to mind a lot of similarities with areas of Latin America. I think particularly, you know, Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, at different points. And I just wondered about the broad link here between economic history and environmental history, and particularly the history of capitalism, because what you were talking about in some of your examples is a lot of liminal spaces, effectively, and the tension between the private and the state government is interesting there. And of course, these were lots of areas that were then incorporated in quite a brutal way after the Civil War, and especially when the sort of might of the triumphant army is turned westward. And so, is there something? And of course, this is the danger of thinking about it in this way, is that there is a space available for escape from the state under a kind of semi-feudal relationship of weak government in the South, which is not the case, because there's, as you mentioned, there's all the slave catchers and everything. But is that something that is perceived in the shift in the relationship between people and the environment? Do you think that with this kind of bundle of protections that come with the government comes less of a interactive, custodiary relationship with the environment?
That's a good question. I think it's less to do with the relationship with the state and more to do with a very particular kind of capitalism. And I think, as you know, that there's been a huge debate over the past generation about the nature of slavery in the United States, and is it capitalism or is it not, and what kind of capitalism is it? And where I come down in the book on it is that the kinds of calculations that enslavers are making are very much driven by market forces. They're looking at how can we extract as much labor from the people we own. How can we use violence to do that? Other kinds of psychological torture to do that. But also, how can we extract as much value from the land at a price that is reasonable? And if that means cutting down the forest and then, finding the next forest to cut down later, that they're okay with that. I think the idea that the land is something to be cherished, the land is something to be that preserved or maintained. For most enslavers, that was a foreign idea to them. That they really always were constantly looking for the next area where they could, the next sort of cotton frontier, if you will, where they could reestablish the system on fresh land and make higher profits. You know, and slavery in the American South has, enslavers themselves often said they weren't capitalists, but in terms of the kinds of choices they are making, they are very much doing this kind of calculation, either literally in their, on a piece of paper or in their heads, about what kinds of systems of labor, what kinds of systems of agriculture and mining and lumbering would drive them the most profits.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jay.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your brilliant talk. I was just wondering about, you talked about land exploitation for short-term profit, and obviously maintaining that ability to make profit means using military or paramilitary force. So I was wondering to what extent enslavers and later Confederates, or contemporaneously Confederates, tried to exploit the environment for military purposes. You already mentioned the canals, which is obviously a sort of quite military thing to do, but then there's the environment of the plantations themselves, and then later the battlefields of the Civil War. So where did they get their knowledge of the landscape and environment, and what use were they putting it to militarily? Second question, what kind of dogs would enslaved people have had?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll answer the second one first because that's a clear answer. There were some that were called bloodhounds, which were dogs that were a specific breed of dog that were bred to catch enslaved people, and these seem to have been imported from Cuba, where many of this breed was bred, created, whatever. But there are many enslavers who kept dogs, which were not literal bloodhounds, for slave catching. And it was common, so we have a variety of different breeds that were used. Some of them were dogs that were owned by the enslavers themselves, and some of them were dogs that were owned by people who were slave catchers as a profession. So people who were professional slave catchers who had a pack of dogs that they would then send to try to pursue fugitive slaves. As to your first question, that's a really complicated question, one I probably can't answer fully in the time we've got. But thinking about the ways in which the Confederacy is using the environment, one of the advantages that they perceived that they had was that the South is a very challenging environment to navigate. There are rivers, there are mountains, many of the same obstacles that William Anderson mentioned, are also obstacles to Union armies going through the South. And many Confederate officers talk about the ways in which they had the advantage, that both the knowledge of the land, but the land itself was a barrier to easy advancement of Union forces, and that they could use that land defensively, positioning themselves on hills. And in as much as the Confederacy is fighting a defensive war, they were able very often to position themselves appropriately to make Union advances that much more difficult. So we can think about, the assault on Fredericksburg, for instance, in December of 1862, where the Union Army has to cross a river and go up in a very steep embankment to assault Confederate positions, and weren't very successful at it. But throughout, thinking about the ways in which enslavers are using the environment to their advantage, there are ways in which the environment is being transformed to make the work of the enslaver easier. The environment's being transformed by draining swamps. They said, look, if we can drain the swamps, that we can both cultivate new fields, but we can also get rid of the Maroons who are living in the swamps. They also realized that if they cut down trees, it'd be easier to catch enslaved people who are running away. because open fields are much easier to surveil, especially if you are on horseback. There's a great account that I talk about in the book where some people who are involved in helping people to escape from Kentucky into Ohio said, look, this used to be a lot easier to help fugitives escape from slavery because they could hide in the woods and make their way across the river. But that a series of clear cuttings had removed much of that forest land, which made it that much harder for enslaved people to conceal themselves, but also made it that much easier for slave catchers on horseback and with dogs to track them down.
Thank you. Jonas, you had your hand up, but now I don't see it. Did you still want to ask a question? Jonas Lim? No, if not, Aaron.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. Really enjoyed that, especially the imagery that you've been able to uncover here. So the visual component was really fascinating.
Thank you.
I have two questions, and both are maybe a little open-ended, so apologies for that. But I am really interested in the degree to which both slaveholders and the enslaved people are thinking about the relationship to the environment in religious or Christian terms. So to what degree do they understand disasters or these sorts of things in the terms of Christianity, or do slaveholders justify extractivism that they're engaging in the terms of religion or Christianity? And then my second question is, to what degree do these plantation holders or owners of like herds, especially, I assume feral hogs, or like hogs and feral hogs, or
yes, I got a whole bit on feral hogs. Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll have to check out that chapter. But maybe you could talk about the degree to which they're actually in control of these herds, or they believe themselves to be in control of those herds.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll tackle the second one first because it's fascinating and weird. So one of the ways in which Southern agriculture developed in a different direction than the rest of the country and in Europe is that Southern planters maintained sort of open range husbandry much longer, so that they would have herds of cattle, of pigs, of other animals that were not penned in, but were allowed to forage in forests and swamps and other sort of non-agriculturally productive land. And enslaved people were in charge of finding these animals and bringing them back at the appropriate time for slaughter or what have you. Frederick Douglass, for instance, does this for a period of time as a child. And Northern observers who come to the South, one of the things they comment on is the quality of Southern livestock. And they say, look, their pigs are very skinny, their cows are very skinny, they clearly are not doing husbandry right. And they attribute it to slavery. They say, look, the system of slavery is creating this framework of agriculture that is making the animals suffer and making the animals less inferior to the animals that they're familiar with. And you know, in the process of this kind of husbandry, not all the animals end up getting rounded up. So there are large numbers of feral animals, especially feral hogs, especially in places like Arkansas. And some of these feral hogs are huge. I think you probably know this, but many other people don't have a good conception of how big these animals can get. They weigh hundreds of pounds, sometimes more than 1,000 pounds. They are angry and dangerous, and they come in large packs, sometimes 50 of them, and they will demolish a field. They'll come in and eat everything. They will trample things. They will eat. They'll eat anything, including other animals. So they are really quite dangerous, and they have a huge effect on the landscape. these animals are not only trampling fields, but they're trampling wild plants that grow on riverbanks. They're eating all kinds of things. They're having a tremendous effect on the environment. There's sort of the sort of trickle down effect of those animals is quite profound, and they're outcompeting other animals. And so if we're thinking about sort of the ecosystem more broadly, one of the things I was trying very hard to do in this book is to not only look at what effect enslaved labor had on landscape, but what the sort of second and third order effects were, in terms of not only are they cutting down trees, but what happens to the birds that live in the trees, what happens to the, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a number of animals that go extinct in part because of the ways in which enslaved agriculture transforms the landscape. Okay, let's go back to your first question. One of the things I think you see a lot of evidence of is that enslaved people saw the woods, forest, non-cultivated land as a sanctuary, and they saw it as a place where one could pray. I mean, if we think about the Nat Turner prior to the rebellion, one of the things that he does is he goes into the woods for spiritual inspiration for himself and to preach to other enslaved people and to plot rebellion. And so there is a religious element to that. Enslavers don't have that kind of emotional and spiritual relationship with wild spaces. They often avoid them if they can. They see them as problematic land and lands to be avoided. Lands to be transformed if possible, and in thinking about the religious language, by the 1830s and 1840s, lots of white Southerners are using the Bible to say, look, God has given us dominion over other people. God ordains slavery as an institution, and so it's only right that we have dominion over people and we have dominion over the land and the animals, and they could derive a sort of biblical justification for the choices that they were making. Terrific choices, but that's the way they could sort of mentally wrap their head around it.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. Henna.
Hi, thank you, David, so much. That was an incredible talk.
Thank you.
I especially love the stuff about the environmental ethos and how slavery needs to spread to survive. It's actually something I'm doing in class with Aaron right now. But what I wanted to ask was about more of the Low Countries and rice plantations, because as we know, rice was not indigenous to North America, and it's something European planters wouldn't have any knowledge of how to plant. I was wondering if you could expand on maybe the West African influence.
Sure,
there.
right. So this is called the black rice hypothesis that you're referring to, and the premise behind it is that the rice agriculture in the South is borrowing techniques for rice cultivation from West Africa. And you see a number of historians starting in the 1970s talk about this idea. People like Peter Wood, a few other people who are writing about the Low Country. And the argument is not only are they taking techniques, but they are purchasing enslaved people from West African societies who have an experience with rice cultivation, and that they are using that expertise sort of against them, if you will, to transform this landscape. There have been other historians who have looked at this and say some of the evidence doesn't actually add up as neatly as people want to. And I have a very extensive footnote at one point that describes these various debates that originally had in the text, and the editor said, no, that belongs in a footnote, so I put it in a footnote. But it's a very long and painful footnote. One of the things about the Low Country is rice cultivation. Slavery is bad everywhere, but working on a rice plantation is particularly horrific. If you look at sort of the death rates of people who are working on rice plantations, they're really very, very high. And rice cultivation required transforming the environment in very profound ways. It involves a whole system, a hydraulic system. Rice has to be flooded a series of times, and they have a whole calendar of flooding the rice fields and then draining them and flooding them again, draining them again, which requires having tremendous local knowledge about the tides. They're using the tides and the rivers and the ways in which rivers are ebbing and flowing with the tide, because what they want to do is they want to get the fresh water from the river, but not the salt water from the tide. And so they have really quite profoundly complicated hydraulic systems to get the kind of water they want and the right amount of water and store it for the right amount of time. And what have you. And so they are remaking the entire landscape of the Low Country to transform it into these rice plantations. But for enslaved people who are working there, these are horrific places to work. You know, they are working very often in sort of ankle to knee deep water. There are poisonous snakes that are living in the water. There are alligators that sometimes that emerge in the water. So deeply unpleasant places. They're working in extreme heat. You know, not only are they getting the sun on their backs, but they're getting all the sunlight reflected off of the water they're working in. So it's a place where you're seeing slavery transform the landscape and seeing the environment very much shaping the lives of the enslaved. The Low Country is one of the places that is really a prime example of that.
Thank you.
I have a question. David, are there any other hands up? Do you see any other hands up?
I do not.
No. Okay. Oh, well, that's good news for me. I suppose what I was thinking about, David, is just the formidable difficulty of transforming the physical environment of the Mississippi Delta. But I was also thinking, well, in North America, there were many other many other environments that were maybe kind of comparably intractable, and yet were utterly transformed. And so I was wondering, what's your view as to how much difference slavery makes to the physical transformation of the Delta environment? Can you imagine all those trees being cleared, all those swamps being drained, the rivers prevented from being overflowing, the panthers and the alligators killed? Can you imagine all that happening absent slavery?
The short answer is no, right? Or at least not in the time frame that it happens. I mean, I think one of the transformation of the Mississippi Valley, you know, in the first half of the 19th century is fundamentally tied to the growth of slavery as an institution, the rise of cotton, and to a lesser extent sugar in the Mississippi Valley. You know, and there's a couple of conveying forces that are working together. One is that enslavers are seeing this land as being very fertile, so they send enslaved people to cut down all the trees. Solomon Northup does this, for instance. He's sent up the Red River, which feeds into the Mississippi, and he's on a gang of people whose job it is to clear land to build a cotton plantation. And he describes going there and saying, this is before they start cutting down all the trees. He says, this is beautiful. Like, look at the sort of canopy of trees. And then they just proceed to clear cut all of it to transform it into a cotton plantation. The steamboat that allows the Mississippi to become a two-way highway, if you will, consumes a tremendous amount of timber. And if you think about the work that steamboats are doing, steamboats get very romanticized in American history. They are conduits for cotton coming down the river and enslaved people going up the river. And they are doing so by burning a tremendous amount of wood. They have sort of two different kinds of steam engines that are used on steamboats. And they say, you know, we could do the slow one that burns a little bit of wood, or we can do one that's a little bit faster, burns a tremendous amount of wood. And they said, look, speed is of importance. We are going to cut down as many trees as we need, because cutting down the trees not only services the steamboats, but it also allows us to cultivate more cotton. And I think there's these sort of confluence of factors that drives a transformation in the landscape, which has effects today. I think one of the arguments I make in the book, or sort of hint at in the conclusion, is that these landscapes are very different. Are different today as a consequence of the choices made in the 18th century and the early 19th century. You know, one of the tragic things that happened in writing this book, and this is a book that had lots of tragedy built into it. You know, there's a section where I'm talking about the animals that have gone extinct as a consequence of some of these choices. And there was a particular species of bird that I had listed in the draft that I submitted to the press as possibly having gone extinct as a consequence of choices in the early 19th century. And during the time that they were doing the copy edits, that bird was proved to be extinct. And so I had to cut out the word possibly, and that made me cry. And there was obviously lots of things in this book that were, yeah, difficult to work through.
Perhaps I could ask one more question,
Sure.
David. I expect you know John Barry's book, Rising Tide,
Sure.
about the 1927 Mississippi flood. And one of its really ghastliest passages is of African-American laborers having to lie on top of the levee near, is it Greenville maybe, to prevent the river from overflowing. And you just read that passage, or you read the debates in the same book about plantation rations and things like that, and you just you can't avoid the kind of maybe glib conclusion that this is just slavery under a different name. And I wonder if some of the forms of extreme exploitation that occur in the context of environmental transformation in your book, is there actually some fundamental transformation as a result of emancipation, or would your hunch be that many of the same themes that you're concerned with in your book have a much longer lineage and last into the 20th century?
So I think I'm going to say both. I mean, I think that emancipation had profound consequences, and it did change both the lives of the enslaved and the relationship to the environment. For instance, one of the things that happens with emancipation is that this westward spread that sort of dominates slavery as an institution, that stops, right? And you think about sharecropping, you have families who are sharecropping the same land over and over again, rather than clearing new land to plant cotton. And you start to see profound usage of fertilizer. We have the South was the region of the country that used the least fertilizer, and then it becomes the region of the country that uses the most fertilizer, because the ways in which land tenure was understood and the ways in which people were stuck on a particular piece of land was different. But I think the bigger point, I think you're definitely right, that there are legacies today of slavery, of white supremacy, in terms of how the land is used, in terms of who suffers the most from environmental destruction. You know, and all natural disasters, as you know, are really human disasters. They're about choices people are making. I was lucky enough a few weeks ago to participate in a forum at the Whitney Plantation. For those of you who aren't familiar, Whitney Plantation is in Louisiana. They are known as being one of these, they're a plantation house, a sugar plantation, but they focus on the lives of the enslaved. And about a year ago, they were hit with a hurricane, Hurricane Ida, which damaged a number of their buildings. And they decided to hold a forum to try to sort of make sense of not only what the environment meant to their location, but what it meant to their region of Louisiana, and how was it questions about the environment embedded with questions about race. You know, and that's also a region of the country that has had tremendous environmental destruction from petroleum extraction, from chemical companies. You have what is called Cancer Alley, that basically runs through the plantation belt of Louisiana. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that if we look at the people around the United States today who are suffering the worst consequences of, or some of the worst consequences, not obviously not all of the worst consequences, but some of the worst consequences of environmental destruction, they are people who are poor and people of color. And I think that's true not only in the United States, but around the world. And I think recognizing how race and the environment intersect, I think is going to be one of the great challenges that we have going forward. Thinking about how to create environmental justice. Not only do we save the planet, but how do we save the people who are on the planet, and especially those peoples who have been devastated by climate change and other environmental destruction.
Maybe before we finish, David, if we just have time for you to tell us all what you're going to do next.
Oh, okay, sure. So what I'm working on at the moment, I'm looking at Reconstruction. I'm looking at the people who fought against white supremacist violence during Reconstruction. So people who fought against the Klan in a variety of different ways. And what I'm writing is a group biography of 20 individuals, men and women, African Americans and whites, some from the North, some from the South, who in one way or another fought against the Klan during Reconstruction. And their lives intersect in interesting and complicated ways. And not all of them are going to live to the end of that book when I get around to actually doing more of the writing. But that's what I'm working on now. I'm trying to sort of make sense of who fights against white supremacist violence, because in the scholarship, there's been a lot of attention paid to the Klan, but not as much paid to the people who put their lives on the line to create a biracial republic after emancipation. So
Sounds like
more happy, uplifting stuff. But
yeah, no, really important project, and I do look forward to reading that book too. Can we just finish by thanking David for a really superb presentation and really vivid, lucid, visually arresting presentation, and for your very sort of concise and interesting answers to our questions. You've got our series off to a really good start, and I'm very grateful to you. And people more adept than me at all this stuff can find the symbol that they need in order to clap you. I'll do it that way.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed being able to do this today.
Yeah. Cheers, David. Have a nice evening. And
You too.
That goes for everyone too. See ya.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.